Following World War II and the widespread destruction of European cities, New York City was poised to serve as the new global capital of diplomacy with the completion of the United Nations headquarters in 1952, and is quickly gaining ground on London to become the premier global financial center. This economic boom saw large-scale migration of African Americans from the South and immigrants from Puerto Rico coming to work in the city's many textile factories, on top of the many World War II veterans returning and wanting to start a family. To fill the affordable housing demand caused by the returning soldiers and the ensuing baby boom, Abraham Levitt and his sons William and Alfred bought a potato farm on Long Island and created a new community of 17,000 homes called Levittown, effectively creating the first modern suburb. Due to societal tension from racism between ethnicities and a lack of housing within the city, white residents began to move outwards to the suburbs en masse in a movement called white flight, causing the population to decline for the first time in city history by the 1960 census. This outward migration of middle-class whites changed the dynamic of New York, with many older apartment towers being torn down and replaced with large office towers meant for the workers to commute to. The city's once thriving textile industry was faltering due to outdated facilities and cheaper labor found elsewhere. These facilities, many found in Midtown Manhattan, were then torn down and replaced by drab, large-scale public housing projects, further deteriorating the aesthetic of the city. The decrease in foot traffic and people living within Manhattan caused economic difficulty and the widespread closure of stores, with dwindling ticket sales eventually leading to the Dodgers and Giants baseball teams both packing up and moving to California. From this point forward, increased automobile traffic and the initial post-war boom caused thick clouds of toxic smog to blanket the city, further decreasing the desirability to live there. Budget shortfalls caused many public workers to go on strike, with the most devastating being the 1968 strike of sanitation workers, which lasted 6 months. During the strike, piles of garbage filled the streets and the quality of life within the city began to fall off a cliff. Times Square no longer was a central point of culture, but rather a hotbed of pimps, prostitutes, and drug addicts. In 1960, the Eisenhower administration became embarrassed when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. Initially claiming it was a NASA research plane, Eisenhower quickly had to walk this claim back and tell the truth when the Soviets produced wreckage. This incident began a series of protests and began a sense of distrust in the government for the first time for many Americans. The children of the greatest generation, the generation that fought during World War II, and their children were known as the baby boomers, were a much larger generation when compared to their parents and grandparents. This large new market was ripe for the picking during the 1950s as clothing companies and media outlets started producing products intended for a younger audience. More empowered youth mixed with a glut in available labor allowed more young people to choose to go to college, causing enrollment to grow 500% during the 1960s. University campuses offered a safe place for students to congregate and exchange ideas about how they viewed the current issues. Many students became angry with what they saw as injustices in the treatment of minorities, especially blacks, the unnecessary death and destruction caused by the Vietnam War, and an increasing urgency to address rising pollution. It was from Columbia University in New York City that a group of students began to form to express discontent with the relatively conservativeness of post-war society, beginning what we know as the counterculture. The movement found a safe haven in the neighborhood known as Greenwich Village, a place where residents strive to live a bohemian lifestyle, meaning one that mirrors the passiveness and lack of desire to assimilate lived by the people in the Bohemia region of Czechia. These left-wing students mixed with other groups in Greenwich Village, such as the primary LGBT community in the country, which formed after the invention of modern birth control and the sexual revolution, led to changing ideas about what sex was and what its purpose was. And the beatniks, who were older members of the counterculture. The beatniks were from the members of the silent generation, the one that came before the greatest generation, and they pushed for greater artistic representation, especially in the form of poetry and a preference to contemplate and look back on life rather to reinvest oneself to fit in with the increasingly competitive capitalist landscape. But by the 1970s, the dream of changing the world through protest was beginning to sour for young people as they grew older. The outright decay and increasing violence of New York City caused the beatniks and other artists to flee the city and move to San Francisco on the West Coast to join a smaller yet growing literary movement based around the introduction of the Japanese haiku to the American audience, resulting in what is known as the San Francisco Renaissance. The counterculture that remained in New York City stopped trying to promote change and instead decided to watch passively as society crumbled around them. In 1973, The World Trade Center was completed in the financial district of Manhattan with the goal of revitalizing the blighted area. Although this helped improve the city's image somewhat, the 13.4 million square feet of office space flooded the city and caused office values to drop, further straining the city's budget. The World Trade Center would struggle for the next decades to secure tenants to fill its space, reaching a high of a 95% occupancy rate in 2001. By 1975, the city's financial condition had deteriorated so bad that the city was no longer able to pay their creditors and was on the verge of bankruptcy. First, the city appealed to President Gerald Ford for a bailout, but this was resoundingly rejected. Instead, the city had to turn to an advisory board created at the state level rather than the city, called the Emergency Financial Control Board, with the goal of righting New York City's precarious financial position. The voices of city officials were limited, with many seats on the board going to bankers who ran the city's large financial industry. The bankers demanded swift changes to prevent insolvency, which were not popular among people in city government. Among these changes were a mandatory wage freeze for all city employees, subway fare hikes, and the charging of tuition for residents attending city colleges, which was a right that was previously free. By 1977, the city successfully had paid down their short-term debt, but was hit with another devastating crisis, a major blackout that lasted for 25 hours and saw widespread looting and rioting and resulted in $300 million in damage all in one night. Now, unlike previous blackouts, which saw very little uptick in crime, people acted out of fear and paranoia relating to the ongoing acts of a serial killer known as the Son of Sam, who brazenly murdered 6 young women within the city, often in the presence of their boyfriends. So, at this point, national opinion on New York was that it was a very violent and dirty place that was a shell of its former self. Lack of interest in new developments caused entry costs to be low, and with bankers in charge of managing the city, Donald Trump was in the perfect position to buy up many old and dilapidated buildings in Midtown Manhattan for cheap, using generous financing from the banks. Donald's father, Fred, started the Trump Organization, a real estate development firm that started by building suburban houses in the 1950s, graduating on to the constructing of public housing complexes demanded by the city. Fred gradually transferred control of his business to his children, with Donald becoming president of the company in 1971. In 1978, when the city was at its lowest, Donald gained notoriety by purchasing the Commodore Hotel, built in 1918. The Commodore's floor plan was outdated, and the old exterior of the building lacked enough windows and natural light. So Trump was able to successfully renovate and convert the hotel into the new Grand Central Hyatt. After its reopening in 1980, Trump turned to develop Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan, which would serve as the organization's headquarters. The 1980s saw the Trump Organization rapidly expand with the purchases of Trump Palace in 1984 and Trump Castle Casino in 1985 in Atlantic City, New Jersey, as well as the famous Mar-a-Lago resort where he now resides. In 1988, he built his own casino in Atlantic City called the Trump Taj Mahal, as well as the purchase and renovation of the Plaza Hotel in New York. Things began to head south as the company had greatly overextended itself, and by 1992 was facing serious cash flow issues. Of principal concern for Trump was the mounting daily losses at the Trump Palace Casino caused by the continual winnings of Japanese high roller Akio Kashiwagi. Trump consulted a statistics expert who found a game with odds so low that Kashiwagi would almost certainly lose. The statistician was right, and Kashiwagi lost $9 million in earnings in a matter of minutes. Unfortunately for Trump, he was never able to collect this debt, as Kashiwagi was found hacked to death in his hotel room with a samurai sword from Japanese Yakuza gangster members, who also ran off with all of the money. This loss dealt a devastating blow to the Trump Organization, with Trump having to declare bankruptcy in 1992. The 1990s began to see a change in Donald Trump's demeanor as he gained increasing popularity and star power. His highly public divorce of his first wife, Ivana, in 1990 helped cement him as a household name for Americans. Part of this new persona was his marriage to actress Marla Maples in 1993. It was during this time of increasingly popularity that Donald Trump continued to see his businesses falter. Spare the successful purchase and redevelopment of 40 Wall Street in 1996, a building which is still in Trump's portfolio today. He began to lose ownership in the buildings in his existing portfolio, exacerbated by debt taken on to finance the Riverside South redevelopment in New York. At this point, he had to change strategies due to restructuring and began to simply license the Trump name to be placed on buildings rather than outright owning them, converting Donald from a questionably successful businessman into a marketing guru. The common idea that Donald was instrumental in the revitalization of New York made him well liked, and in 2004 he entered the television scene as the host of Celebrity Apprentice. While Trump started as a registered Republican, he became involved in Ross Perot's centrist Reform Party in 1999, beginning his political career with an unsuccessful run for president as their nominee. He registered as a Democrat in 2001, switching to Republican in 2009, then registering as an independent for a year, and then back to Republican permanently in 2012. In the lead up to the 2012 election cycle, Trump began to establish a more right-wing persona by publicly attacking President Barack Obama over the status of his birth certificate. It was during the 2011 White House Correspondents' Dinner where the president and comedians lined up to take jabs at the Donald, and rightfully so. He did not take this criticism well, and when the camera pans over to his enraged face and pursed lips, one gets the feeling he is plotting to prove everyone wrong at the dinner that a Trump campaign would be more than just a publicity stunt. To tie back, the new counterculture that emerged during the late 70s and 80s in Silicon Valley began to no longer strive to change the world through protest, but through technological advancement, primarily through the widespread adoption of personal computers and the internet. The internet revolution allowed a rise in individualism in replacement of collective action. Now, anyone could be a part of their own subculture or online community, which eroded the idea of a dominant and counterculture. It was a revolution because up until this point, computers were very large and expensive and were developed out of the military, university systems, and large corporations using government funding. The PC democratized the internet and allowed power to be shared among many actors. However, this power base began to shrink into the hands of fewer and fewer large corporations who handled our data and the programs we used. Donald Trump, being an observer of human emotions and tendencies, tapped into this siloing of Americans into their different communities to exploit the fear of a disenfranchisement of white Americans. These closed communities acted like echo chambers for anyone participating in them, leading the members to only hear information that supported their pre-existing notions, called confirmation bias. As talked in a previous video, the changing to the seventh political party system in U.S. politics saw a large group of the poor working class white electorate who would have otherwise not voted or voted Democrat switch over to the Republican Party after hearing Trump's message. These voters felt left out of the competitive manufacturing landscape ever since the signing of NAFTA and gradually saw their communities fall into decline. Trump recognized this discontent and seized an opening within the Republican primary to bash Washington insiders and greedy corporations who moved supply chains overseas to cut costs. While blue-collar workers had long been Democrats due to their strong ties to the union, unions have by and large failed to stop plants from closing and jobs from going elsewhere, and thus were willing to change parties potentially permanently. Trump was able to withstand harsh criticism and retribution for persistent lies told on the campaign trail because the electorate had become numb. Past instances such as the U-2 incident discussed earlier, the Iran-Contra scandal, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq helped cement the idea that the political establishment could not be trusted. To them, someone who was seen as a brash and unfiltered outsider was a breath of fresh air and a chance for their conservative lives to remain relatively the same without having to adapt to changes in the global economy. To the shock of everyone, including the Trump campaign, Trump won the 2016 election and became the 45th president of the United States.